Good afternoon, current events class. I'm Kaizak Griffin, and this is All Things Israel. Today, we're going to be talking about why the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, will not be attending the ceremony of Nelson Mandela held in South Africa December 10th, Tuesday. We're also going to go into two separate deaths that have occurred in Israel, leading to a lot of conflict between Palestine and Israeli governments. Finally, we're going to cover current issues with Israel and Iran, and why Secretary of State John Kerry thinks we are closer to peace than ever. Stay tuned. The tragic death of the South African President Nelson Mandela has brought news home back to Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he will not be able to attend the funeral services. This is because of the high cost of the flight as well as security considerations that are involved. The death of Nelson Mandela has sparked even more anti-Israel feelings, as Nelson Mandela himself was a Palestine supporter. One of his more well-known quotes being, "If Palestine is free, no one is free." Nelson Mandela's speeches have been used to spark pro-Palestine support. And now, in the midst of his death, Palestinians are using his influence to gain followers. Palestinians saying it is now their time to fight against their controller, Israel. Despite anti-Israel feelings, Netanyahu deeply regrets not being able to attend Nelson Mandela's funeral services, saying that he is the father of his nation, a visionary, a freedom fighter who opposed violence. Let's go to our reporter, Wesley Kay, who will be speaking more on the subject with Professor Griffin. Wesley? Thank you, Kaizak. I'm here with Professor Griffin. Griffin, care to tell us more about this situation with Mandela? Absolutely, Wesley. I, for one, am worried. I think that with the death of Nelson Mandela and his opinion of Palestine and how he wanted it to become a sovereign and recognized nation, I think that could become a huge problem for Israel, where in the wake of his death and given his background, the Palestinians could use that and almost turn it into their story and really allow it to be the catalyst that just sparks a revolution in Palestine. And that's a scary thought, Wesley. I'm particularly worried about other Middle Eastern countries becoming involved, specifically Iran. As we know, Hamas, as it is, huge terrorist group in Gaza, and it's, part of Palestine. If Iran decides that this is the perfect opportunity, or even has probable cause to start sending more support to Hamas, it could lead to way more suicide bombings or just more conflict in Israel that we really don't need right now. And now, do you see Prime Minister Netanyahu not going to South Africa for the memorial as a symbol, if you would, against Nelson Mandela for his support of Palestine? Not at all, actually. I don't think he's not deciding to go as a statement against Palestine and Palestinian supporters. I think that it really shows how dangerous of a position he is in as the Prime Minister of Israel, the most hated region in the Middle East. It's just not safe. He can't as easily leave the country as the presidents or prime ministers of other nations. He's in a way, he's wanted dead by several other Middle Eastern leaders and people alike. I think that it was just too short notice for him, and he's worried for his life. Yeah, absolutely. Back to you, Kai. Thank you, Wesley. And it seems we have more violence coming out of Israel between the Palestinians and Israelis, as a man was sentenced to death by hanging in Gaza on December 5th for the accusation of collaborating with Israeli authorities. The man was only identified by the initials AK and was tried in a Hamas-run court where there's a death penalty for murder, drug trafficking, and collaborating with Israel. Although all executive orders must be approved by Palestinian chairmen, Hamas no longer recognizes the legitimacy of Mahmoud Abbas and therefore doesn't abide by his rules. This is the 17th execution that has taken place since 2007 in Gaza. Why don't we go back to Wesley Kay and Professor Griffin to get a closer analysis on the situation. You don't want one? Alright, to yourself. Thank you, Kaizak. I'm Wesley Kay, here with Professor Griffin. Professor, Hamas has publicly and deliberately gone against Mahmoud Abbas. They've executed 17 people. Now with this most recent one, what's your take on this? Right. Well, if you know what Israel looks like, then you know you have Gaza and the West Bank. And they're both Palestine-controlled, and they're both surrounded by Israel and Israeli people. Now both groups, Palestine and Israel, are incredibly worried about spying, which in this situation could be as easy as just walking down the street. And that's how incidences like this break out, where a man is hanged for collaborating with Israel. And of course now you have instances where Israel is spreading false accusations about Palestinian officials, saying that they're collaborating with Israelis in order to cause confusion in Palestine. And now, how do you feel about Hamas saying, "We don't recognize you, Mahmoud Abbas. We disregard your leadership"? Hamas not recognizing Mahmoud Abbas is just another red flag. Israel and Palestine are in this seemingly endless boxing match, and it just seems to be a matter of time before one of them gets knocked out. And instead of breaking it up, we've got the US coaching Israel and Iran coaching Palestine through Hamas. And it's occurrences like this hanging that fuel both sides and make any possibility of peace even more difficult to achieve. As long as Hamas is supported by Iran, I don't see any possibility of Israel coming up with any agreements. And then you have to wonder, well, is Iran waiting for a draw in the boxing match? Or are they waiting for a quick uppercut and a knockout for Israel? Scary stuff. Scary stuff indeed. Absolutely. And unfortunately, the violence continues from there, as a 15-year-old Palestinian boy was killed in the West Bank Saturday, December 7th. Wajdi Waha al-Ramahi was in the Jalazouin refugee camp when reports of a gunshot fired from a watchtower by a member of the IDF, or Israel Defense Forces, hit the 15-year-old boy, killing him instantly. The supposed reason for the gunfire was because of a dispute between the Palestinian refugees and the Israeli army. Palestinians, now enraged at Israel, have gathered up in protest against what they see as a brutal murder. Palestinian President Abbas has come out and blamed Israel for being destructive to the peace process. Let's go to the West Bank to our reporter on the field to get a closer look at the anger in Palestine. Sammy?
There will be justice.
Thank you. Now let's head back over to Wesley Kay and Professor Griffin. Checkmate. Thank you, Kaizik. Alright, so this definitely touches upon the point you were making earlier. A man is hanged for collaborating with Israel. A boy is shot by an IDF. Abbas spoke of the Israelis being destructive to their peace. Would you consider Israel and Palestine to be at peace? No. The situation between the Palestinians and the Israelis is controlled chaos at best. Both groups have potential to excel economically, but are so caught up in violence that neither can reach their fullest potential. Right. And with this incident being so greatly projected by the Palestinian public, how do you feel other countries will respond to al-Ramahi's death? Well, it's a bit extreme to say that a single death will trigger the next world war. But it has happened before. The reality of it is that with today's level of globalization, it actually allows for this story, or incidences such as this, to travel. And what happens is, you have a death in Israel that people in America are talking about the next day. And believe me, communication can be a powerful weapon. Let's look at this story a bit. There was a supposed dispute between Palestinian refugees and Israeli soldiers. We have no idea who started it, or what it was about. All we know is that an IDF member, who may or may not have been acting in self-defense, fired a shot that may or may not have been the bullet that killed al-Ramahi. Until the autopsy report, there's no way of even knowing if the boy was shot by Israeli forces. And when there's constant clashes between these two groups, unfortunate tragedies such as this are bound to happen. However, even though nothing about this case has been determined, it's going to be distorted in several different ways because of globalization and modern media. So even if you see this in an article for New York Times tonight, and it's labeled, "An accidental shot fired by a fearful Israeli soldier," it could appear on the news in Iran under the title, brutal murder of innocent Palestinian boy by Israeli forces. So let's look at how communications can turn this situation into a global conflict. Alright, so what I have here is a horribly drawn map of some Middle Eastern countries. Let's just have a look at some scenarios that could occur from this incident, which happened here, in the West Bank. Now, Gaza is also a Palestinian region, which is controlled by Hamas. A terrorist group funded by Iran. Bear with me here. Let's say Hamas is angry about this death, so angry that they plan a violent terrorist attack on Israel. Well, they'll need aid from a more than willing Iran, and maybe Iran will be even so willing and on board that they'll contact Hezbollah, a terrorist group in Lebanon. Lebanon being right here. Hezbollah, we'll assume, also attacks Israel. Hezbollah, who will contribute to the attacks. Well, now Israel's in trouble, and who are they going to ask for help? Certainly not any of these Middle Eastern countries, especially not Syria. They're going to ask their pals America, who of course is always more than willing to fight some terrorism. So we'll just draw America. Hope this is... We'll just imagine that, this is all the way across Africa and, on the other side of the world, but America. They're going to ask their pals America, as I said, who of course are always willing to fight some terrorism. Now the U.S. probably won't send more than money and weapons. This map is getting harder and harder to follow, but bear with me. But even then, you have the result of the Iran funding attacks on Israel, and the U.S. funding its defense. This makes Iran angry at the U.S. But right now, with Iran developing nuclear energy and the U.S. trying to make friends with Iran's leader, Rouhani, the last thing we want, or the U.S., is a problem with Iran. And that's how the death of a single boy in the West Bank could very reasonably become a global issue involving the U.S., Iran, Lebanon, and maybe other countries. Well, Professor Griffin, you may not make the best maps, but you do bring up a great point about Iranian conflict. Which brings us to Secretary of State John Kerry's trip to Israel and the progress he believes he's made between Israel and Iran. Kerry assuringly stated that the U.S. and Israel's goals are synced towards Iran's nuclear power program and what should be done about it. Kerry met with Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and spoke on the matter at hand. There were talks of a deal that would loosen sanctions on Iran in exchange for more limitations on their nuclear power program. Kerry assured Israel that their defense was his main focus. While in Israel, Kerry also attempted to make some breakthroughs in peace between Israel and Palestine. After speaking with both Israeli Prime Minister and Palestinian President Abbas, Kerry says that both sides are determined as ever to negotiate a peace deal. Kerry said, "The parties are closer than ever to realizing a two-state solution." Kerry established a 9-month deadline for the two parties to make a peace agreement, but it has shown no success. The U.S. says they will only support a deal that results in both parties being safer than before. Israel said it's ready for a two-state solution, but the U.S. has to provide its security needs beforehand. Even though not much progress has been made towards a peace agreement, Kerry remains hopeful. And our final story this evening, unfortunately it contradicts with Kerry's hope for peace with Iran and Israel, as Defense Minister of Israel makes some shocking accusations about Iran. Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon exposes Iran for supposedly smuggling weapons into South America and then using drug routes to smuggle them into the U.S. to possible hidden terror groups within the U.S. As if drug trafficking from South to North America wasn't bad enough, under Yaalon's suspicion, Iran is distributing weapons to these